All right, so I'm after doing a whole series on the oppositions in astrology. I figured, well, thinking about doing a series now on the squares, but I'm starting to realize that the squares may be more of a complicated procedure, and as such, it might be a good idea to um, kind of do an introduction video here, basically. Um, so what I first started thinking of for the squares is what do squares have in common, right? Um, the squares, they all happen along the axis points of the modalities, which we would call cardinal, fixed, mutable. Another name for this is the quadruplicities from traditional astrology, but we can also call them the modalities. Um, so, and I think what I'm kind of emphasizing with my project here is whole sign aspects, basically, and that really the true meaning of a square, as I'm putting forth here, isn't just like a 90-degree angle, but rather it's the relationship from one sign to another. And that if you really want to understand in a pure sense what square means, you're going to have to look at these combinations, of which there are only 12 combinations actually. It looks like there's a lot going on here, but there's really one square for each sign, right? Now, you might think that, oh, wait a minute, but like, a sign can be squared on either side, right? Well, what I'm saying here is that there's only for each sign there's a position where it's in the superior square versus the inferior square, right? So if we look at each of these, for example, in the cardinal signs, at the top we see Mars and Aries being squared by Capricorn. It's not really Mars and Aries. I just have the planets there to give a kind of a note about what the planetary rulership is. But here we have basically Aries being squared by Capricorn, right? If you look at the bottom there, and then Aries is in the superior position to Cancer. Okay, um, and so I'm gonna go switch over to the my other little graphic that I've made here. The whole meaning of this thing about a superior square comes from this idea of what you would call being upon the 10th or decimation. And basically that is the sign which is in the preceding order, which is to say, in this example we have what is called the thema mundi that has Cancer on the ascendant. So from the point of view of Cancer, Aries is in the superior position. Now, I thought it would be good to do a video on this because it starts to get down to understanding what squares are really all about, when compared to, let's say, an opposition. Okay, in an opposition, I didn't even bother making a video introducing the opposition because I think we're so, our we're almost like programmed to think about things in these binary opposites, right? Like if you're familiar with Carl Jung and his whole thing about holding the tension of the opposites, like it's kind of it's such a familiar idea to us. It doesn't really need to be explained, but I think with the square, it's worth it to kind of point out anyways that traditionally the square wasn't just two things having an equal sided conflict with each other, right? It's either, heads or tails, kind of two sides of the same coin, right? With an opposition. With a square, you've got one of the signs is in a superior position, which means one of the signs has an edge on the other one, right? Which is a completely different dynamic than the kind of like evenly matched face off that you're having in the opposition. Um, what I would like to compare this to, perhaps, I was thinking about what you kind of illustrate with this. I'm thinking in a lot of mythic tales, it's like the hero, the protagonist, which we could say representing the position of the house one here, would go to the king for one reason or another, and then the king would place a trial or something. You have to bring me back the head of this giant, or whatever. You have to rescue the princess, and or what. So you see how like all of our video games and our little things that are kind of Dungeons and Dragons are built on the hero's quest or something like this, right? That's Joseph Campbell stuff about the hero's journey. And like you got Hercules or whatever having to perform all these feats or whatever, right? There's something about, and the David and Goliath or something like that, right? Like in this sense here, Cancer is the David to the Aries Goliath in a way, right? That there's the hero has to come up against a kind of obstacle, right? And as and as such, that coming up against an obstacle, being challenged, or having to fulfill some sort of task or trial, I'm thinking could be a way to like look at what squares are about, anyways. Another way to understand it is that if you look at the house meanings, the 10th house is, to put it simply, it's usually the career house, right? It's what's your job, what are you doing with your time and your life, and in some sense it's what are your responsibilities and what's expected of you in a way, right? There's something about the 10th house which is like you have to show up and fulfill a certain amount of expectations in order to fulfill your role as your job and earn your paycheck, kind of thing. Now, so I think in a way you can look at the square as, instead of being this even exchange, it's like there's a certain, one sign is placing a demand on the other almost, right? And it's sort of, and that's where you get this thing about being decimated. The decimation means it would be like in Roman military things, to decimate an army would be to kill 1 out of 10 men. You've been decimated is when you've been reduced by a tenth. It could also mean to be like taxed or something like that. You've earned so much, but then you're kind of cranky because you get you get taxed, whatever. But this is kind of like there's more of this thing of like it's more of an uphill battle, right? It's not as on even playing ground. So what I plan to be doing for this talk is that I plan to be doing a video basically for each of these 12 squares, right? And to talk about the square between each sign as a kind of dynamic into itself, right? But I think, anyways, that's my kind of goal. I'm hopefully I'll be motivated enough to see this one through to the end. But I think before I go here, there's some other things I think that are worth reflecting on. I'm just going to take a break though and sort of reflect, and we'll come back to this in a second. A quick note about this graphic as well is that part of another way to understand the whole superior square thing is that let's take this example of Cancer and Aries, okay? So let's say if the sun or some kind of planet, let's say the sun was in Aries, it's going to take 1 to 3 months for the sun to eventually move to the position of Cancer, right? Now, it's going to take a hell of a lot longer for the sun in Cancer to get all the way back to Aries. So what is also suggested by the fact that it's kind of an uneven challenge is that it's almost like Aries is saying to Cancer, hey, I need you to come and complete this Aries kind of job But Cancer is like, well, in order to do that, I'm gonna have to get through 75% of the damn zodiac before I can get to where you are. It's like, it's easier for you to say that, but I got a long way to go to get there, kind of thing. So so that's part of the reason why a square is so challenging, is because it's sort of like, it's almost like one sign is kind of trying to get asking the other one to bend over backwards to sort of meet some kind of challenge or something. Like it's not just like, oh, can you do this thing that's kind of easy? It's asking it to do a really challenging thing, because it's not really, it's in the position. It takes a lot of work to get there from that position, basically. So I thought I'd throw that one in too, before moving on or whatever. So I just like to point out here that when I made these charts, I kind of just started with Aries, because it's traditionally seen as like the first sign of the zodiac. I could have done it with Cancer instead, right? That might have made more sense, actually. You doing traditional astrology, you start with Cancer, but so it wasn't really thinking here. I was just like, let's just start with Aries, right? But so, and then similarly with fixed, I started with the first fixed sign, Taurus, and then with mutable, the first mutable sign, Gemini, right? Now, as you look at the way the rulership scheme is divided here, I think you start to notice some interesting things, right? Now, the most obvious thing I think that's noticeable straight off the bat is when you look at the mutable signs, it's only Jupiter and Mercury that rule the mutable signs, and the Jupiter and Mercury aren't involved at all in any of the cardinal and fixed signs as domicile rulers, right? So that's like a first obvious difference. So there's obviously this interesting difference between mutable and cardinal and fixed. Cardinal and fixed are a little bit more similar to each other than the mutable ones. But then so let's look back to cardinal and fixed. Forget about mutable now. There's interesting stuff going on here. So where you've got Mars for Aries and Venus for Taurus, you can see the gender polarity there, of course, right? But then you go look at what are the next in the next what's the square that comes here? It's Saturn, right? And that's similar to the Saturn because you've got the two Saturn signs lumped together, right? And then if you look okay, so what's the other ones that are here? The next one in the order that I've laid out are Mars and then Venus again, right? So it's like inverted. So Saturn's the same, but the genders are switched in a way. And then you've got the genders switched between Moon and Sun, and so on, right? So you've kind of got this weird gender inversion happening between the cardinal and the fixed, which is interesting. And let's something completely different. Let's hop to tarot cards here, which is interesting. So tarot cards, the court cards, forget about the page is just sort of like a kind of a primary elemental association. But when you look at the knight, the queen, and the king, the knight in tarot is associated with mutable. The queen is associated with cardinal, and the king is associated with fixed. And so now we see that Leo is a fixed sign and Cancer is a cardinal sign. So so you've got the sun and the moon. Maybe that makes sense for the king and the queen in tarot, right? And mutable, you've got mutable is like the knight who's a speedy, racing through on his horse kind of thing. So it's natural that Mercury would be there in the night cards, right? Now, and Jupiter as a knight, that's another kind of I'm not quite sure about how to explain Jupiter's mutability right now. I'm kind of just winging this as exploration. I mean, there's something about Jupiter as growing, expanding, that maybe Jupiter is more, of the influence of change, and that's why it works with it's kind of like the progressive planet, whereas you can make sense that the Saturn is a fixed, it works for the fixed, maybe works for the cardinal as well in a way, right? Like Saturn's more about consolidating, holding on, that kind of thing, whereas you could see like a Jupiter in Pisces being more about letting go, right? Or a Jupiter in Sagittarius more about, just moving on to the next thing or whatever, right? Um, so these are just some, and this is basically part of why I'm doing this is like, for me, why do I like astrology? Is it because I like categorizing people into like, personality type boxes? Honestly, I'm not really into that. Is it because I'm trying to like predict the future or something? Honestly, it's never been a big attraction either. But there's something for looking. Some of these patterns where I'm looking at this. I just made this today. I've never noticed some of these patterns before about when you see these inversions between cardinal and fixed, and the sort of like there's a hidden symmetry to the system, and I think this only works if you use traditional rulerships. And so I'm just kind of, what I'm doing here is I'm kind of like bringing you guys along for my crazy little ride of poking around in all these weird areas in astrology that I don't really hear people talk about. So this is a kind of a niche audience thing, but hopefully if there's people who appreciate or are interested in this side of astrology, maybe you get it. Maybe you'll appreciate what I'm doing here. I think that's about it for now. This is just basic, some thoughts that are coming up as I'm starting to put this together and consider, sort of contemplate the deeper meaning of these squares, right? And so this is kind of informing. I'm kind of building some preliminary theory here before I go into each one of these and try to understand the dynamic of what's really happening in each of these squares. Maybe that will sort of build and change as I go through it. This is sort of the beginning of the journey, in a way. And if if anyone is noticing things that I'm missing here, is anything else they'd like to, be cool to that. If you have any other, you want to make some contributions, some suggestions, or anything, or if you want to play along here too, you can, right? I encourage, like, I won't feel quite as like I'm off my crazy crackpot journey all by myself here on this one, but anyways, let me know what you think. Anyways, hopefully somebody out there is appreciating this. I'm back with just one more thing here, right? Just one more thing before I leave. And I think there's something by looking at, as you lay it all out, it also tells you something about, okay, let's look at mutable again here, right? So mutable has Jupiter in these positions, like where you have a Saturn square with Venus, or a Saturn ruled sign squaring a Venus ruled sign, or Saturn ruled sign squaring a Mars ruled sign. In immutable, you've got Jupiter squaring Jupiter, right? And you've got a lot, but that sort of suggests, though, that there's a kind of a similarity between Jupiter and Saturn and Mars. And if you look at the mythology, is interesting because Jupiter was a son of Saturn and Mars was the son of Jupiter. Okay, so there's a hereditary kind of link there. I don't know if that makes any, but then, and Venus is there as kind of like the female, the Mars Venus kind of share the two sides of the same coin, is the gender kind of thing, right? So if you look over, and you've got the luminaries for fixed and cardinal. What do you have immutable? No luminaries, but Mercury playing a more pronounced role, right? In mutable, you have more of a binary thing going on between Mercury and Jupiter, and then with cardinal and fixed, you've got more of a multiplicity happening, but the luminaries are there as kind of like, maybe, I wonder if you could almost make an argument that it's almost, you have sect leaders, like you have Sun as the leader of the nocturnal sect and Moon as the leader of the diurnal sect. If you look at this, you could say that in these positions, the Sun sort of plays like a leadership role for the fixed signs. The Moon maybe more of a cardinal sign leadership role, and then that equivalent shows Mercury, which is not very fitting for Mercury being the mutable sign. You know, the kind of the swinging both ways, being, you know, crossing between the underworld and the day world and all that kind of thing, right? That fits that Mercury would be like a luminary to the mutable signs, and the solar king as a fixed position, the moon, and then maybe the moon introducing that kind of the other side of the change, right? Like changing out of being a mercurial thing and the introduction of a new thing being the moon, right? And that being kind of counterbalanced from the luminaries with that opposition to Saturn that we talked about, and that being held in check with the dynamic between Mercury and Jupiter on the other hand. I don't know, I'm just sort of like having little things I want to add to this as I go. Hopefully you can kind of follow what I'm trying to say here. I don't know if maybe if I present this in written form it would be more cleaner. I don't know. Well, I'm just kind of winging it here. Let me know if you guys have any questions or comments or whatever.